When Maggie O'Sullivan stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Copper Ridge, Arizona, she thought she was just taking a job cooking for a widowed rancher and his 4 children. She had no idea she was about to walk into a household where 4 little souls had been praying every night for God to send them a mama. What happened next would transform not just their lives, but hers in ways she never imagined. This is the story of how a desperate widow became the answer to children's prayers, how a broken man learned to love again, and how a family was born not from blood, but from something much stronger. But the road to that miracle was filled with heartbreak, danger, and moments that would test everything they thought they knew about family. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones God pieces together from the broken parts of other people's lives. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Copper Ridge as the afternoon stagecoach rolled to a stop outside Murphy's General Store. Maggie O'Sullivan clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, her knuckles white against the brown handles as she peered through the grimy window at the frontier town that would be her new home. 6 months of traveling from one failed job to another had brought her here, to the middle of nowhere, answering an advertisement that had been posted in 3 different territories. Cook needed for widowed rancher and 4 children, must be of good character, room and board provided. She stepped down from the coach, her black mourning dress already gathering dust, and looked around for any sign of Samuel McCready. The advertisement had said he'd meet her at 3 o'clock sharp, but the street was mostly empty except for a few cowhands lounging outside the saloon and an old-timer whittling on a bench. Maggie had been a widow for 8 months now, ever since Patrick died in that mining accident back in Colorado, and she'd learned to be suspicious of men who didn't keep their word. "You Miss O'Sullivan?" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough like gravel. She turned to see a tall man emerging from the shadow of the general store's awning. Samuel McCready was broader than she'd expected, with shoulders that looked like they could carry the weight of the world, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. Everything about him spoke of a man carrying burdens too heavy for one person. "That's me," Maggie replied, lifting her chin with the kind of confidence she'd had to learn the hard way. "And you're late." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe even amusement, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Had to settle a dispute with some cattle rustlers. This is frontier life, Miss O'Sullivan. Things don't always run on schedule." He gestured toward a weathered wagon hitched to 2 horses that looked like they'd seen better days. "The Double M is about 5 miles out. We'd best get moving before the sun gets any meaner." As they rode through the desert landscape, Maggie studied the man beside her. He sat rigid as a fence post, eyes scanning the horizon like he expected trouble to come riding over the next hill. She'd known men like him before, men who'd learned that life was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk. "Tell me about the children," she said finally. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "Billy's 12, takes himself too seriously, but he's had to grow up fast. Lucy's 9 and stubborn as a mule. Gets that from her mother. Tommy's 6, quiet as a church mouse most days. And little Emma." His voice softened just a fraction. "She's 4, hasn't spoken much since." He didn't finish the sentence, but Maggie understood. Death had a way of stealing words from children. The Double M Ranch appeared before them like a mirage. A sprawling adobe house with a red tile roof, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of better times. But Maggie could see the signs of neglect everywhere. Loose fence rails, a sagging porch step, laundry hanging crooked on a line strung between 2 posts. This was a place that needed a woman's touch, desperately. As they pulled up to the house, 4 small faces appeared at various windows and doorways, watching her with the wariness of wild animals. The eldest, Billy, stood on the porch with his arms crossed, trying to look like the man of the house. Lucy peered around the corner of the barn, her hair tangled and her dress torn at the knee. Tommy sat on the front steps, whittling a piece of wood with intense concentration. And little Emma was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the youngest?" Maggie asked, as Samuel helped her down from the wagon. Before he could answer, a small voice piped up from under the porch. "I'm here." Emma crawled out from the shadows, dirt on her face and straw in her golden curls. She looked up at Maggie with eyes that seemed far too old for her 4-year-old face. "Are you the lady who's going to make us food that don't taste like boot leather?" Maggie couldn't help but smile, the first real smile she'd felt in months. "I suppose I am. Think you can help me figure out what you all like to eat?" Emma nodded solemnly, then suddenly blurted out, "I've been praying for a mama. Are you her?" The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Samuel's face went stone still, and the older children stared at their sister with a mixture of horror and hope. The desert wind whistled through the silence, carrying with it the weight of expectations Maggie wasn't sure she was ready to bear. "I'm just here to cook, sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling down to Emma's level. "But I promise the food won't taste like boot leather." Emma studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if this answer was acceptable. But as Maggie stood and gathered her belongings, she caught the look in the little girl's eyes, a look that said she'd been praying for more than just a cook, and maybe, just maybe, her prayers were about to be answered. Maggie's first morning at the Double M began before dawn with the sound of something crashing in the kitchen. She bolted upright in the small room Samuel had given her, barely more than a closet with a cot and a wash basin, and pulled on her robe. In the kitchen, she found Billy standing over a pile of broken crockery, his face red with frustration and embarrassment. "I was trying to make breakfast," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Pa's been doing it, but he's already out checking the cattle," and Emma was crying that she was hungry, and I thought. "No harm done," Maggie said gently, stepping carefully around the broken pieces. "Why don't you show me where everything is, and we'll make breakfast together." For the next hour, Billy watched in amazement as Maggie transformed their sparse pantry into a feast. Real biscuits, not the rock-hard lumps Samuel had been producing, eggs that were fluffy instead of rubbery, even gravy that didn't look like paste. When the other children crept into the kitchen, drawn by smells they'd almost forgotten existed, their eyes went wide. "Holy Moses," Tommy whispered, staring at the golden biscuits. "That smells like when Mama used to cook." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lucy shot her brother a warning look, but Maggie just smiled and began setting plates on the scarred wooden table. "Well then, let's see if it tastes as good as it smells." The children ate in reverent silence, as if speaking might break the spell. Emma, who had been picking at her food for months according to Samuel, cleaned her entire plate and asked for seconds. When Samuel finally came in from the morning chores, he stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene, his children actually eating, the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of real food, Maggie humming softly as she cleaned the stove. "Coffee?" she asked without turning around. He nodded, settling heavily into his chair. The coffee she poured him was strong and hot, nothing like the bitter swill he'd been choking down for months. Over the rim of his cup, he watched his children chatter and laugh in a way he'd almost forgotten was possible. That afternoon, while Samuel was out mending fences, Maggie discovered the true state of the household. Clothes that had been mended so many times, they were more patch than original fabric. A pantry that was nearly bare except for beans and hardtack. Children who'd been trying so hard to take care of themselves that they'd forgotten how to be children. She found Lucy in the barn, trying to milk a cow that was clearly giving her trouble. The girl's face was streaked with tears of frustration, and her dress was soaked from the cow's thrashing tail. "Need a hand?" Maggie asked quietly. "I can do it myself," Lucy snapped, but her voice broke on the last word. "Pa says I'm the woman of the house now, so I have to do women's work." Maggie knelt beside the stubborn girl, Being the woman of the house is a big responsibility for someone who's only 9. I'll be 10 next month, Lucy said fiercely, and Mama was only 23 when she became the woman of this house. Your mama was also a grown woman who chose to be here, Maggie said gently. You're a little girl who should be playing with dolls and learning to read, not trying to run a household. Lucy's defenses crumbled. But if I don't do it, who will? Pa tries, but he don't know how to braid hair, or mend dresses, or make Emma stop crying at night when she has nightmares about Mama. That evening, after supper, Maggie found Emma sitting on the porch steps, talking to a rag doll that had seen better days. The little girl was whispering earnestly to the toy, and Maggie caught fragments of the conversation. New lady is nice. Maybe she'll stay. Maybe God heard our prayers. What's your doll's name? Maggie asked, settling beside Emma on the steps. Mama, Emma said simply. I named her Mama so I could still talk to her. The words pierced Maggie's heart. She thought of the baby she'd lost, the children she'd never had, the dreams that had died with Patrick. But looking at this little girl who was so desperate for a mother's love, something inside her chest began to crack open. She's very beautiful, Maggie said seriously. I bet she's a good listener. Emma nodded solemnly. I tell her about my day and ask her to watch over us. Sometimes I pretend she answers back. She looked up at Maggie with those 2 old eyes. Do you think that's silly? I think, Maggie said carefully, that talking to people we love is never silly, even when they can't answer back the way we want them to. That night, as Maggie lay in her narrow cot, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Her door creaked open, and Emma's small silhouette appeared in the doorway, clutching her doll. Miss Maggie, the little girl whispered, I had a bad dream. Can I sit with you for a minute? Without hesitation, Maggie pulled back the covers. Emma crawled in beside her, and within minutes the child was fast asleep, her small hand curled trustingly in Maggie's. As the desert wind whistled around the house, Maggie realized that somewhere in the space of a single day, these children had begun to work their way into the empty spaces of her heart. 3 weeks into her stay at the Double M, Maggie had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The children had begun to trust her. The house was cleaner than it had been in months, and even Samuel had started lingering over his morning coffee instead of bolting his food and disappearing into the ranch work. But frontier life had a way of testing people when they least expected it. The first test came in the form of a fever that struck little Tommy on a sweltering Tuesday morning. Maggie found him burning up in his bed, his small body shaking with chills despite the desert heat outside. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when she touched his forehead, her heart nearly stopped. He was hotter than a branding iron. Billy, ride into town and fetch Doc Harrison, she commanded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Tell him it's urgent. Lucy, I need you to help me get cool water and clean rags. Emma, sweetheart, you stay out of this room for now. For the next 18 hours, Maggie barely left Tommy's side. She bathed his burning skin with cool water, spooned willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and held him when the fever dreams made him cry out for his mother. Samuel hovered in the doorway like a caged wolf, his face drawn with the kind of terror that only a parent who'd already lost too much could understand. He's burning up, Samuel said roughly on the second night, his voice breaking, just like when Mary took sick. Maggie looked up from where she sat beside Tommy's bed, her hair falling loose from its pins, her dress wrinkled from hours of nursing. He's not going anywhere, she said with a fierceness that surprised them both. I won't let him. And she didn't. By the third morning, Tommy's fever broke, and he opened his eyes to find Maggie still there, exhausted but smiling. Miss Maggie, he whispered, you stayed. Of course I stayed, she said, smoothing his damp hair back from his forehead. Where else would I be? From the doorway, Samuel watched this exchange with something shifting in his storm cloud eyes. Later, when Tommy was sleeping peacefully and Maggie finally stumbled to the kitchen for coffee, Samuel followed her. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. Maggie nodded, too tired for words, but when their eyes met across the kitchen table, something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than employer and employee. The second test came in the form of Jake Thornton, a land grabber who'd been circling the struggling ranches in the territory like a vulture. He rode up to the Double M on a Saturday afternoon, with 2 hired guns flanking him, his smile as oily as his slicked-back hair. "Heard you got yourself a new cook, McCready," Thornton said, tipping his hat in Maggie's direction as she stood on the porch. "Mighty pretty one, too. Wonder if she knows what kind of trouble she's gotten herself into." Samuel stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "State your business, Thornton, then get off my land." Now, no need for hostility. I'm here to make you an offer, a generous one. This drought's been hard on everyone, and I hear you're behind on your bank payments. I'm willing to take this burden off your hands." "Ranch isn't for sale," Samuel said flatly. Thornton's smile turned predatory. "Everything's for sale, McCready. It's just a matter of price, and sometimes—" His eyes slid to Maggie again. "The price isn't always money." The threat was subtle but clear. Maggie felt ice in her veins despite the desert heat, but before Samuel could react, she stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton," she said sweetly, "I couldn't help but notice those fine horses you're riding. It would be such a shame if something spooked them and they ran off into the desert. Wild animals out there, you know. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, coyotes. Why, a man could wander for days before finding his way back to civilization." Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath that made Thornton's smile falter. Behind her, she heard Billy cock his rifle. When had the boy gotten his father's gun? "This isn't over, McCready," Thornton said, backing his horse away from the porch. "You can't protect what's yours forever." After the men rode away, Samuel turned to Maggie with something like amazement in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Maggie replied firmly. "This is my home too now." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she'd intended. Samuel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That night, Emma crawled into Maggie's bed again, but this time she wasn't alone. Lucy followed, then Tommy, still weak from his fever, but determined not to be left out. Even Billy, trying to maintain his dignity as the man of the house, ended up curled on the floor beside the bed with a blanket. "Miss Maggie," Emma whispered in the darkness, "are you really going to stay forever?" Maggie thought about Jake Thornton's threats, about the way Samuel had looked at her when she called this place home, about 4 children who'd already lost one mother and were terrified of losing another. "As long as you'll have me, sweetheart," she whispered back. "As long as you'll have me." The crisis that would change everything began with a single piece of paper delivered by a nervous-looking clerk from the territorial courthouse. Samuel read the notice twice, his face growing darker with each word, before crumpling it in his fist and letting loose a string of curses that made even the horses look scandalized. "What is it?" Maggie asked, wiping flour from her hands as she emerged from the kitchen where she'd been teaching Lucy to make pie crust. "Foreclosure notice," Samuel said bitterly. "The bank's calling in my loan. I've got 30 days to come up with $800 or they're seizing the ranch." The words hit the family like a physical blow. Billy went pale, Lucy burst into tears, and little Emma ran to Maggie's skirts, burying her face in the fabric. Tommy just stared at his father with those 2 serious eyes, as if he'd been expecting this moment for months. $800, Maggie repeated, her mind racing. That was more money than most people saw in 2 years. "Surely there's some mistake. You've been making payments." "Not enough, apparently," Samuel said, his voice hollow. "The drought killed half my cattle, and what Thornton's men didn't rustle, the coyotes got. I've been barely scraping by, and the bank, well, they want their money now." That evening, After the children were in bed, Samuel and Maggie sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. The weight of impending loss hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. "Where will you go?" Maggie asked quietly. Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Don't know," he finally said. "Maybe head north. Try to find work in the copper mines. The children—" His voice broke slightly. "They'll have to be split up. Billy's old enough to work, maybe find a place as a ranch hand. Lucy could work for a family in town, and the little ones—" He couldn't finish. "No." The word came out sharper than Maggie intended. "Absolutely not. Those children have lost enough." Samuel looked at her with tired eyes. "You got a better idea?" "Because I'm fresh out of miracles." Maggie was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to the edge of the porch. When she turned back, there was something fierce and determined in her expression that Samuel had never seen before. "How much do you know about my late husband?" she asked. "Not much. You said he died in a mining accident." "He did. But what I didn't tell you was that Patrick O'Sullivan struck silver 3 days before that mine collapsed. A rich vein that the company tried to hide after his death." She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "They paid me to keep quiet about it. Blood money, I called it. I've been carrying it around for 8 months, too angry and hurt to spend a penny of it." Samuel stared at the pouch. "How much?" $1,000. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Samuel slowly shook his head. "I can't take your money, Maggie. It wouldn't be right." "It's not about taking," she said firmly. "It's about investing, in this ranch, in this family." She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. "In us." The word hung in the desert air, heavy with implications neither of them had dared voice before. Samuel stood slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Maggie," he started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I know what this looks like, a desperate woman trying to buy herself a family. But that's not what this is. These children, they've become everything to me. And you—" She took a shaky breath. "You've become everything to me too. Not because I need rescuing, but because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with all of you." Samuel closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands framing her face gently. "You sure about this? About us? Because once I accept your help, once we become partners in this ranch, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she whispered. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers. "Will you marry me, Maggie O'Sullivan?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because of the money, not because the children need a mother, but because I love you more than I thought possible." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, yes, yes." The next morning, they rode into Dustfield together with all 4 children piled into the wagon bed. First stop was the bank, where Maggie's blood money became the salvation of the Double M Ranch. Second stop was Pastor Mills's little church, where a small crowd gathered to witness Samuel McCready marry the woman who'd saved his family in more ways than one. Emma insisted on scattering wildflowers during the ceremony. Lucy cried happy tears for the first time in months. Tommy stood straighter than a soldier, and Billy quietly whispered, "Thank you, God," when he thought no one was listening. As they exchanged simple gold bands in the afternoon light, streaming through the church windows, Maggie knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones built not on passion alone, but on the solid foundation of choosing each other every day, no matter what storms lay ahead. The honeymoon period lasted exactly 3 days before life reminded the newly formed McCready family that happiness on the frontier came with a price. Maggie had barely finished moving her few belongings into Samuel's room when trouble arrived in the form of a letter bearing an official territorial seal. "What now?" Samuel muttered, tearing open the envelope while Maggie braided Emma's hair at the kitchen table. His face went ashen as he read. They're contesting the marriage. Who's contesting it? Maggie asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Jake Thornton. He's filed a claim saying the marriage was fraudulent, entered into solely to prevent foreclosure. Says a woman can't use her own money to pay off another person's debts and then marry them without it being considered a business transaction rather than a legitimate union. Billy, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with his jaw set in a way that reminded Maggie painfully of his father. Can he do that? Can he really break up a marriage? He can try, Samuel said grimly. Territorial law is still being written out here, if he can convince a judge that our marriage isn't legitimate. Then what? Lucy demanded, her voice shaking. They take away Mama Maggie? The title slipped out so naturally that Lucy didn't even realize she'd said it until the words hung in the air. Maggie's breath caught, and Samuel's eyes softened despite the gravity of the situation. Did you just call her Mama? Tommy asked his sister with wide eyes. Lucy's cheeks burned red. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Miss Maggie. I know you're not really our... I am, Maggie said firmly, standing and pulling Lucy into her arms. If you want me to be, then I am. Papers and judges and men like Jake Thornton can't change that. Emma bounced up from her chair. Does this mean I can call you Mama too? Out loud, all the time? Yes, sweetheart, all the time. The legal challenge consumed the next several weeks. Samuel had to travel to the territorial capital twice for hearings, leaving Maggie to run the ranch with just Billy's help. During his absence, she proved she was more than just a cook and mother. She could rope cattle, mend fences, and shoot the rattlesnake that threatened the chickens with deadly accuracy. But it was during the second week of Samuel's absence that the real test came. Maggie woke to the sound of horses approaching fast in the pre-dawn darkness. Through the window, she saw torches, 6 men on horseback surrounding the house. Billy, she hissed, shaking the boy awake. Get your father's rifle and stay with the girls. Don't come out no matter what you hear. She stepped onto the porch with Samuel's shotgun cradled in her arms, her nightgown billowing in the desert wind. Jake Thornton sat his horse in the center of the group, his face twisted with malicious satisfaction. Mrs. McCready, he called mockingly, or should I say Miss O'Sullivan, seeing as how your marriage might not be legal much longer. It's Mrs. McCready, Maggie said calmly, though her heart was pounding like a war drum, and you're trespassing on my land. Your land? Thornton laughed. That's rich. This whole charade is about to come tumbling down, woman. And when it does, these children are going to need someone to take care of them. I know some folks back east who pay good money for young workers. The threat was clear, and it made Maggie's blood turn to ice. But before she could respond, a small voice piped up from behind her. You leave our mama alone. Emma had slipped past Billy's watch, and now stood beside Maggie, tiny fists clenched, glaring at the men with all the fierce protectiveness of a wildcat defending her cubs. Emma, go back inside, Maggie said gently, but the little girl shook her head. No, these are bad men trying to hurt our family. She looked up at Thornton with those guileless 4-year-old eyes. My mama told me that God punishes bad men who hurt children. Are you going to be punished, mister? Something in the child's absolute certainty seemed to unnerve Thornton. He shifted in his saddle, his confidence wavering slightly. But it was what happened next that truly sent him retreating. One by one, the other children appeared on the porch, Lucy with a kitchen knife in her hand, Tommy clutching a pitchfork, and Billy with his father's rifle trained steady as a rock on Thornton's chest. This is our family, Billy said, with a voice that cracked only slightly. And if you want to hurt them, you'll have to go through all of us. Maggie had never been prouder or more terrified in her life. But as she looked at these 4 children willing to fight for their newfound family, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever legal challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Thornton must have seen something in their united front that convinced him this wasn't the time or place for violence. This isn't over, he snarled, wheeling his horse around. Judge arrives next week. We'll see how long your little family fantasy lasts then. After the men rode away, Maggie gathered all 4 children into her arms on the porch swing, holding them tight as the sun began to rise over the desert. "Are they really going to take you away?" Emma whispered. "No, baby," Maggie said fiercely. "No one is taking me anywhere. We're family now, and families stick together no matter what." The territorial judge arrived in Dustfield on a dusty Thursday morning, bringing with him the power to either cement the McCready family together or tear them apart forever. Judge William Harrison was a stern man, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily fooled by legal maneuvering. The hearing was held in the town's small courthouse, a cramped adobe building that could barely contain the crowd that had gathered. Word had spread quickly through the territory about Thornton's challenge, and it seemed like half the county had come to witness the proceedings. Samuel sat beside Maggie at the defendant's table, his calloused hand covering hers, while the 4 children occupied the front row with Doc Harrison and Pastor Mills flanking them like protective sentries. Thornton's lawyer, a slick-talking man from Phoenix, presented his case with theatrical flair. "Your Honor, this so-called marriage is nothing more than a financial transaction disguised as romance. The defendant used her monetary resources to purchase not just a ranch, but a ready-made family. This sets a dangerous precedent for the sanctity of marriage in our territory." Judge Harrison listened impassively, occasionally making notes on the papers before him. When Thornton's lawyer finished, he called Samuel to the stand. "Mr. McCready, did you know about your wife's financial resources when you proposed marriage?" "Yes, sir, I did." "And did those resources influence your decision to marry her?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes finding Maggie's across the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'd be lying if I said the money didn't matter. My children were about to lose their home, and I was facing the prospect of splitting them up. But that money, it wasn't why I proposed. It was what gave me the courage to propose." "Explain the difference." "I'd been falling in love with Maggie O'Sullivan since the day she arrived at my ranch. But I was a broken man with 4 motherless children and a failing ranch. I had nothing to offer her except hardship and heartache. When she offered to help save the ranch, it wasn't just about the money, it was about her choosing us, choosing to fight for our family when she could have walked away." The judge nodded thoughtfully, then called Maggie to testify. She stood with quiet dignity, her hands folded in front of her simple blue dress. "Mrs. McCready, you could have used your resources to start fresh anywhere in the country. Why did you choose to stay here?" Maggie looked out at the 4 children watching her with anxious eyes. "Because, Your Honor, those children taught me something I'd forgotten after my first husband died. They taught me that love isn't something you lose when someone dies. It's something that grows when you're brave enough to open your heart again. And if this court rules that your marriage is invalid, then I'll pack my bags and leave tonight," Maggie said firmly, "because I didn't marry Samuel McCready to buy myself a family. I married him because I love him and those children more than my own life. And if my presence here causes them legal trouble, then the most loving thing I can do is go." A gasp went up from the children, and Emma burst into tears. "No, Mama, don't leave us." Judge Harrison called for order, but his stern expression had softened considerably. "I'd like to speak with the children individually," he announced. One by one, he questioned them in his chambers. Billy spoke with the serious determination of a boy trying to be a man, explaining how Maggie had brought laughter back to their house. Lucy, no longer the stubborn little girl who had resented any woman trying to replace her mother, testified through tears about how Maggie had taught her that loving someone new didn't mean forgetting someone who was gone. Tommy, quiet as always, simply said, "She makes Papa smile again. And she sings when she cooks, just like Mama used to do, but different songs." But it was Emma's testimony that sealed the fate of the McCready family. When the judge asked her if she understood what was happening, The 4-year-old looked up at him with those serious blue eyes and said, "The bad man wants to take away our mama, but she's not just our mama because Papa married her. She's our mama because she stayed when Tommy was sick, and she scared away the rattlesnake, and she prays with us every night, and she knows that I like my eggs not too runny, but not too hard neither." When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's decision was swift and final. The court finds that the marriage between Samuel McCready and Margaret O'Sullivan McCready is legally valid and binding. Furthermore, this court warns Mr. Thornton that any further harassment of this family will result in serious legal consequences. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the children rushed to embrace their parents. Thornton stormed out, his schemes thoroughly defeated, while the McCready family found themselves surrounded by neighbors offering congratulations and support. That evening, as they sat around their dinner table in the ranch house that was now legally and irrevocably theirs, Emma raised her glass of milk in a toast. "To our mama," she announced solemnly, "who God sent us even when we forgot to say please." The laughter that followed was the sound of a family that had not just survived its trials, but emerged stronger, more united, and more grateful for the love they'd fought so hard to protect. 5 years had passed since that day in the dusty courthouse, and the Double M Ranch had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the broken family Maggie had first encountered. The adobe house now boasted a wraparound porch painted bright white, flower boxes under every window, and the sound of children's laughter echoing across the desert from dawn to dusk. Billy, now 17, had grown into a man who could rope cattle with the best of them, and spoke to his stepmother with the deep respect reserved for someone who had earned her place through love and sacrifice. Lucy, at 14, had inherited both her mother's beauty and Maggie's practical wisdom, and could deliver a foal or negotiate with traveling merchants with equal skill. Tommy, 11 now, had found his voice at last and filled the house with stories and questions that kept everyone entertained through the long desert evenings. And Emma, 9 years old and still the baby of the family, had grown into a spirited little girl who remembered almost nothing of life before Maggie arrived, for which everyone was grateful. The ranch itself had prospered beyond Samuel's wildest dreams. The cattle herd had tripled in size, the vegetable garden produced enough to sell surplus in town, and Maggie's reputation as a cook had brought traveling customers who would ride 20 miles just to taste her famous apple pie. But more than the material success, the Double M had become something precious in the harsh Arizona territory, a place where love lived and families were born not just from blood, but from choice. It was on a blazing hot Tuesday in July when the stagecoach brought them an unexpected visitor. Maggie was in the kitchen, teaching Emma to can peaches, when they heard the sound of wheels and horses approaching. Through the window, she saw a young woman step down from the coach, carrying a carpet bag that had seen better days, and wearing a dress that marked her as someone who'd fallen on hard times. The woman looked around uncertainly, taking in the prosperous ranch with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone who couldn't have been more than 25. Samuel emerged from the barn to greet her, his hat in his hands in the polite way he'd learned from watching Maggie handle strangers. "Can we help you, miss?" he called out. I hope so," the woman replied, her voice carrying a slight accent that Maggie couldn't quite place. "I heard in town that you might have work for someone willing to earn her keep. I can cook, clean, tend children, whatever you need." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, studying the young woman with the eye of someone who had once stood in a similar place. She could see the desperation carefully hidden behind dignity, the way the woman's shoulders held themselves too straight, as if relaxing might mean collapse. "What's your name, dear?" Maggie asked gently. "Catherine Walsh," the woman replied. "I'm recently widowed, and I've been traveling since there wasn't anything left for me back in Kansas." The words hit Maggie like an echo from her own past. She saw herself 5 years ago, stepping off that same stagecoach with nothing but hope and determination, not knowing she was about to find the family she'd always been meant to have. "We don't really need hired help," Samuel said carefully, glancing at Maggie. "The ranch is doing well, and—" "We always have room for someone who needs a fresh start," Maggie interrupted firmly, earning a knowing smile from her husband. She walked down the porch steps and took Catherine's hands in hers. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. Come inside, and we'll talk about what kind of work might suit you." Over supper, Catherine's story emerged in careful pieces. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay, and in-laws who saw her as a burden. She'd sold everything she owned to pay what she could, and taken to the road, looking for honest work and a chance to start over. "I don't expect charity," Catherine said firmly, her chin raised with the kind of pride Maggie recognized all too well. "I'll earn my way, whatever it takes." "There's a family about 10 miles south," Samuel said thoughtfully. "The Hendersons. They've got 5 young children and could probably use help, especially with the new baby coming." Maggie kicked him gently under the table. "Or," she said meaningfully, "you could stay here for a while. We've got that little room behind the kitchen that's not being used, and Lord knows this family can always use an extra pair of hands. Lucy's getting to the age where she needs a woman to talk to about, well, things that aren't really my place to discuss." Catherine's eyes filled with tears she was trying hard not to shed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Maggie said softly. "I know you're brave enough to ask for help when you need it, and proud enough to want to earn your way. I know you've lost everything and you're still standing. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Emma, who had been listening with the intense curiosity of a 9-year-old, suddenly piped up. "Are you going to be our new sister?" The innocent question made everyone laugh, breaking the tension that had been building around the table. Catherine smiled for the first time since arriving, and Maggie saw a glimpse of the woman she could become once the grief and fear had time to heal. "We'll see, sweetheart," Maggie said, winking at Emma, "but I have a feeling Miss Catherine is going to fit right in around here." That night, as they prepared the little room for their unexpected guest, Samuel shook his head in amazement. "You realize what you just did, don't you?" Maggie smoothed the quilt on the narrow bed, the same quilt that had covered her during those first uncertain nights at the Double M. "I gave someone the same chance you gave me." "No," Samuel said, pulling her into his arms. "You gave someone the same gift you gave us, the gift of family." 10 years had passed since that fateful day when Maggie O'Sullivan first stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Ridge, and the Double M Ranch had become something of a legend in the Arizona Territory. Travelers would speak of it in saloons and trading posts, the place where broken people went to become whole again, where families were forged not from blood but from something stronger, the choice to love unconditionally. The ranch house had expanded twice to accommodate the growing family. Catherine Walsh had indeed stayed, eventually marrying Doc Harrison and moving to town, but not before she'd helped raise Lucy and taught her the gentle arts of healing that would serve the girl well when she married the banker's son. Billy had taken over much of the ranch operations, his strong hands and kind heart making him a natural leader, though he still came to Maggie for advice on everything from cattle prices to courting the school teacher who'd caught his eye. Tommy had surprised everyone by developing a gift for numbers and bookkeeping, turning the Double M into one of the most profitable ranches in the territory through careful planning and smart investments. But it was Emma, now 19 and the spitting image of her adoptive mother, who had inherited Maggie's gift for seeing the wounded and drawing them into the family's protective embrace. On this particular autumn morning, Maggie stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the desert, her hair now streaked with silver, and her face lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from years of laughter and tears shared equally. In her arms she held her newest grandchild, Billy's daughter, born just 3 weeks ago and already showing signs of the McCready stubborn streak. "Another one for the collection," Samuel said, emerging from the house with 2 cups of coffee. At 55 he was grayer and moved a bit slower, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had first captured Maggie's heart all those years ago. "Look at that," Maggie murmured, nodding toward the dusty road that led to town. A wagon was approaching, driven by a young man with a woman and 2 small children beside him. Even from a distance she could see the telltale signs, the carefully mended clothes, the way they sat too straight, the mixture of hope and desperation that marked people who had lost everything and were looking for a chance to start again. "Should I tell them we're full up?" Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Maggie smiled, the same smile that had welcomed dozens of lost souls over the years. "Have we ever been too full for one more?" The wagon pulled up to the house, and the young man climbed down, hat in hand. "Excuse me, folks. I'm John Porter, and this is my wife Sarah and our children. We heard in town that you might have work for a man willing to do anything honest to feed his family." Sarah Porter held her baby closer, her eyes darting between Maggie and Samuel with the wariness of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. The older child, a boy of perhaps 6, stayed close to his mother's skirts, his thumb in his mouth and his eyes wide, with the particular sadness that comes when children understand more about adult struggles than they should. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Samuel asked kindly. "Anything," John said quickly. "I can work cattle, mend fences, break horses. Sarah's good with cooking and cleaning. We lost our farm to drought and locusts, and we've been traveling for 2 months looking for someone willing to give us a chance." Maggie stepped forward, the baby still in her arms, and studied the little family with the experienced eye of someone who had made a life's work of recognizing potential beneath desperation. "Can you handle children?" she asked Sarah. "Because we've got grandchildren visiting most weekends, and Emma here is about to get married, which means there'll be a wedding to plan and a household to reorganize." Sarah's eyes widened. "Yes, ma'am, I love children." "And you," Maggie said to John, "are you willing to learn from a man who spent 40 years figuring out how to make a living in this desert?" "Yes, ma'am, more than willing." Emma appeared in the doorway, beautiful in her simple dress, her face glowing with the happiness of a young woman deeply in love and surrounded by family. "Mama, should I set extra places for dinner?" "Set 4 extra," Maggie said without hesitation, "and tell Tommy to prepare the contract for the foreman's cottage. I think it's time we had someone living there again." As the Porter family unloaded their meager belongings, their faces bright with the first hope they'd felt in months, Samuel shook his head in wonder. "After all these years, you still can't resist a stray." "Neither can you," Maggie replied, passing him the baby and walking down to help Sarah with her bundles. "Besides, strays are just family you haven't met yet." That evening, as 3 generations of McCreadys and their chosen family gathered around the long table that had been extended so many times, it was more patch than original wood. Maggie looked around at the faces illuminated by lamplight, some connected by blood, some by marriage, some by nothing more than the decision to love each other through whatever storms might come. Tommy raised his glass of cider and cleared his throat. "To Mama Maggie," he said solemnly, "who taught us that the best families are the ones you choose, and who chose us when we needed it most. To the double M," Billy added, "where broken people become whole." "To second chances," Emma chimed in, smiling at her parents. "And to the knowledge," Maggie said softly, her voice carrying across the table to every person who had found refuge under this roof, that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as people who need us just as much as we need them. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and somewhere in the darkness, another family was traveling toward hope, not knowing yet that they were heading home.